Awesome. We have some general understanding about JSX, but why don't we take a closer look since it is almost like HTML, meaning it has some features from HTML. However, it is not HTML. So I think it would make a lot of sense if we would understand this once and for all. As a side note, I will going to be toggling my sidebar just so we have more real estate and you can understand everything better. As we're working with the files, of course, I'm going to show you what we're doing and where we're doing. However, the moment we're going to be an actual file, and by the way, you can always see the tab that's going to be on the top. That's going to be a file that we're in. Then I'm going to make sure that at least I'll try to remember to toggle the sidebar because having more space, I think, is just going to give you a clearer understanding. First and foremost, as far as JSX is concerned, we always need to return a single element. So here we can get really creative. Let's say there's a div. Okay, within a div, there's going to be another list. Within our list, first one, I'm going to have some, I don't know, a link. So let's say here, I'm going to say hello world. And then, I don't know, within the div on the top, we have heading 3, hello people, and so on and so forth. So we can place a whole website if we want over here. However, one thing that we cannot do is something like this. So let's say I'm going to decide, okay, so this is going to be more one div. Good. What about this one? I'm going to save it. And right away, first of all, you'll notice two things. Before you even save everything, the actual text editor is going to be complaining. It's going to give you this red squiggly line, which right away means pretty much a bad information. It means that there's something wrong. As well as the moment you run it, it says, well, adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped. So in order to avoid this, we always need to return a single element. How we would save this in this case? Well, if we have a div, then I'm just going to copy and paste this, and I'm going to place them inside. So that would be the basics about JSX. However, I would encourage you to avoid something like this. So I purposely added one more div, but what about the HTML semantics? Don't you think it makes sense that if we're in general using the HTML semantics, since we're always avoiding this div, then please understand that we can always use the semantics right here. So instead of div, I could have said here section. So this could be a section. Then let's say, obviously, I need to have the same closing one. So obviously that is a no-brainer. Then this could be my article. Now, obviously, this is just going to make sense if that is the HTML you're trying to write. Don't write the article where you would want the honored list or something like that. However, I would encourage you to avoid this div scenario where everything you would want to wrap. So we're going to wrap another div and then another div, as well as later on in the course, we're going to look at it. But I can just show you really quickly that there's something called React fragment, where since we always need to return something, instead of placing some kind of HTML element, we can do something like this. We can say React and we can just say fragment. So that's going to be the thing that we're going to be using. And obviously this is going to work the same here. So we can say React fragment. Now the moment we're going to save it, first of all, we know that there's going to be no complaints. So everything is working fine. And second, we're not going to be overpopulating our document with some unnecessary divs. And by the way, the shortcut would be like this, where you have the angle brackets and then you have something like this. So we can save it. And again, this is going to work exactly the same. I maybe went a little bit ahead more than I wanted to, but I think that you can handle the fact that there is something called React fragment, which allows you to skip the adding the divs. However, the most important thing that I'd want you to take away that there's always has to be a single return. Otherwise, if you're going to place two adjacent things side by side, this is not going to work. Okay, what else we have? Well, first of all, there's one extra div that I didn't want, so let me save it, and now everything is going to be working fine. Down the line, I have the div section article, which I already covered, where we should be using HTML semantics, or we should be sticking with React fragments, if that's the road that we want to take. And then let's start talking about HTML attributes. We know that HTML has attributes. Well, what about the JSX? Yeah, we do have attributes. However, there is some caveats and some interesting things about them. Well, first and foremost, we know that in HTML we use class. In fact, we use class a lot, for example, for styling. But the problem is that in the ES6, the latest and greatest version of JavaScript, class is a keyword. So you cannot write this in your JSX. Instead, what you need to write is class name. Now, I'm not going to be setting up anything with the CSS because that's going to be a separate video. We're going to be talking about more features, not just simple class name. But in general, try to understand that you cannot use class as your HTML attribute. You do need to use the class name because the class is already taken as a keyword. So it's not going to make sense. Also, rest of the attributes, you will going to be writing them camel case. Now, what do I mean by this? So let's say there's going to be button. And this is just obviously an example. So understand that this would work with any other attribute too. But for button, what we have? Well, remember we had the on click when we had the JavaScript and when we were listening for some kind of wins. Now, in this case, we're not writing this on click the way we regularly would. Instead, we're writing this on, and then we have the camel case. So as far as the attributes are concerned, make sure that you are writing them camel case because you're writing here JavaScript. You're not writing a regular HTML at the end of the day. All right, what else we have? So we have close every element. Now, what in the world does that mean? We know that in HTML, we have elements, for example, image or input, that don't need a closing tag. So I can just say something like this, and then automatically the HTML, we could actually omit this. We can say, yeah, you know what? I'm just going to have some image, but I'm not going to add the closing tag. Notice what happens here. So right away, the dev server is spitting us back the error because this is not allowed. So we cannot do anything like this. So we always, even though this would be the element that does not require a closing tag, we do need to add here this /. Otherwise, again, your application is just going to break. And if you don't believe me, we can do the same thing with input. And we can say, okay, this is going to be my input. I don't know, color check. No, this is just going to be simple input. And again, what's going to happen with a prettier, this will going to format for us. So a lot of cases, you're not even going to notice that. But I do still need to let you know, just in case you're ever going to encounter some kind of errors, and this could be one of them. So that would be closing every element. And then the last thing, we have the formatting. Now, what do I mean by formatting? Well, first of all, let me delete this. And then you're noticing here that in some cases, I did use these parentheses. In some cases, I didn't. So what all about? Well, first of all, we can omit the parentheses. We can just get rid of them. And we can write our returns here, right after the return statement. So I'm going to say right here, div, and then we're going to add, I don't know, hello world again, and everything is going to be working fine. So your question probably would be, well, why these parentheses are being added? Well, if you're not adding the parentheses, and by the way, again, this is going to be something that Prettier is going to do by default. I didn't do anything here. I just saved it, and the Prettier added parentheses. However, if I choose not to add parentheses, you need to be careful because you always need to make sure that this div, the opening tag, again, in this case div, but any kind of opening tag would be on the same line as your return. Because at the moment, everything is going to be working fine. And again, this is going to give me automatic parentheses. So I apologize, but let me go and mess this up. So in this case, if you do forget it to place it in the same line, notice what happens. So now you're saving it, and now this adds the semicolon. And instead of returning this, it says, well, you're basically not returning anything. Remember the case in the beginning where we just deleted everything and we said we're not returning anything? So essentially, this is exactly what's happening, and that is not allowed. So this is really up to you. You can use the parentheses. You can omit the parentheses. I usually like to start with parentheses and then place my divs here. And then if, let's say, the Prettier removes them, fine, I can live with that. If the Prettier leaves them, obviously, again, there's no problem with that. But at least this avoids me some unnecessary problems where you might save something somewhere and then it might take you a while to actually find it. And worst case scenario, you're actually going to start deleting some perfectly valid code because you're just not going to notice this little semicolon. So let's say, again, this kind of example where I would have some kind of div and I'm going to write everything correctly, but by mistake, I'm gonna forget that this has to be in the same line. I'm gonna save it, and then I'm gonna start fixing some kind of errors that don't exist because my error is the fact that I should have used it in the same line, or I could have used the actual parentheses, and that would have fixed everything for me.